All right, hey y'all. So this was on my heart and on my spirit, so I figured I'd just hop on and make a quick video about it. Usually, most of my ideas make their way into writing of some sort, but today I'm making a video because that's just what called to me. I've been thinking a lot about how we keep each other safe. Now, if you are familiar with me, with my work, you may have heard me say it before, but now is really the time to be doing our protective work for one another. As you can probably infer from the setting behind me, I am a woo-woo, right? I'm a spiritual person, and that means a lot of different things to me. But fundamentally, right, the way that I see and understand the world and the human experience is that in this infinite universe and this small little itty bitty planet that all of us even smaller, ittier bittier people inhabit, right? There is a groundswell of energy. There is a groundswell of creative energy that contains the good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful, the all, right? That is always moving and working around us. And that we, as living conscious beings, not just humans, but all life, have the ability to always tap into. So throughout time and space, humans particularly have given different names to this energy. We recognize it in different ways. It shows up and manifests and presents itself in different ways to us, right? Whether that is the Christian God with a capital H-E, whether that is Allah, whether that is deities of pantheons from different African traditional religions, from different indigenous spiritual traditions across the world, right? From Hinduism, right? That energy, we are just giving a name and different faces and different physical characteristics to the same overarching universal energy that is the reason that all life exists. So within that, I believe, as a woo-woo, as a spiritual person, that we all have access to that, and that it is always present in our creation of the world, right? I understand the world as it is, and all of these systems and institutions and structures that right now seem very confining and very limiting and very violent and very inequitable. I believe all of that is part of us coming together and creating meaning. And when I say creating meaning, I mean anything that we understand as we understand it is a set of agreements that people over time have legitimized by, well, opting in, by, well, believing in them, right? So you can take anything from the alphabet to the numerical system that we use, all the way to the concept of money, right? If we think about the political systems that we have become conditioned to living in, right? All of these are agreements that people made, whether they agreed with them, whether they liked them or not, right? They came together and they created this set of agreements. And people throughout time have just reinforced those agreements, right? So that is how we make meaning as human beings. There is no one universal truth, right? The currency that we use today, for example, is not the currency we use because it is the fundamental universal truth, but rather it's the currency we use because over time and generation and centuries, people have assigned a meaning and a name to it, and enough other people have opted into that, have agreed to accept it, that it has become truth. And I think a lot of the world, everything basically engages with this energy, right? And I might be speaking in kind of abstract terms, but I think thinking abstractly is really important in life. And so that's a good thing. So in thinking about this in abstract terms, right? Everything is pulling on this groundswell of energy that is creating meaning, that is creating the realities of the world today. So when we think about systems of violence, systems of oppression, systems of repression, things that are unveiling themselves to us as we speak, I've written about this on my Substack newsletter, which will be linked below, or if you're watching this on Substack, I've written about this here. I speak about it sometimes on my social media channels. You know, these systems of violence, right? Whether we think about state policing agencies like ICE, like other agencies, right? Or whether we think about systems of like economic violence or inequity, right? Stemming from the C word, capitalism. All of these things are pulling on energy and creating meaning in some way. And so the people who uphold these things the most and who make sure that these structures are maintained and continue to dictate the outcomes of other people's lives, they are pulling on an energy and they are putting it out there to be co-signed, right? So if we think about the idea of, what's a good example? If we think about the idea of artificial intelligence, for example. Now, people have been talking about AI since I was a kid. I am in my 30s now, but it's been a thing, a concept that through media has been just around, right? We've been conditioned to it, particularly in the past couple decades. And in this whole conversation, right, going back to when I was a kid, and it was like this novel idea that like there were going to be AI in the future that did all these cool things or did all these things to benefit, right, society, benefit in some way. The multi-billion-dollar corporations and the billionaires who were plotting and scheming to lead us to the world today that we have, where AI is becoming more and more of a proliferation, when they were pulling on this groundswell of energy to create an agreement around the concept of AI, of artificial intelligence, it was not presented as an option, right? Did you ever hear anyone from these multi-billion-dollar tech companies coming to people and being like, hey, what do you guys think about the idea of artificial intelligence? Do you think we should do artificial intelligence? What do you think artificial intelligence should be used for? Do you even think that it's necessary? Do you think that that's a positive for human society, for non-human life in this planet? It was never presented as an option, right? It was presented as, we are working on AI. It will be developed within your lifetime. You will come to use it more and more. It can do these things, and everyone should believe in it. That's how it was presented, right? So when I say that, like, part of human life is pulling from this groundswell of energy, taking an idea and putting it forward for some sort of mutual agreement, right? That's a really concrete example. AI was this idea that a bunch of people who had a lot of capital to invest into the idea, then present it to the public without debate, without presenting it as an option. They just said this is going to happen. And over time, it happened. Yes, because they were putting capital and investment and technology and time and workers' energy into developing these things. And also because they had already programmed a public to just accept it as something that was going to happen, right? And so there was that energetic agreement to it, because that is a big part of creating meaning. So I'm rambling and I'm talking about these abstract ideas, but I'm going to get us back to the point. What that I opened with was thinking about how we protect one another. We are in a time when I know that for a lot of people, a lot of what is happening, particularly in the United States, but also throughout the world, right? A lot of this violence seems new. It seems novel, right? We have not lived in a time when federal immigration agents have had the license to go into people's houses without legal warrants, have had the license to, just kill people, to kill even American citizens with impunity. We've never lived in that time, right? But that has very much been a part of society before. This is not new. This is not novel. These are ideas that have already been presented and already been co-signed by that collective acceptance that I've been talking about. If you think about, the origins of modern day policing within the United States, you think about the slave patrol, you think about those sorts of things, those were ideas and agreements that were made. And so when I think about ICE agents, I very clearly see the through line between, slave patrols of the antebellum South and the ICE agents and ICE raids that are happening today. These are policing institutions of people who came together around ideas of discrimination, of bigotry, right? That was leading the creation of these institutions. And they came together as individuals who enact the violence of the state on people on the foundation of their identity, of their racial identity, of their citizenship status, right? All of these things are a set of agreements that, again, whether or not you agree with them, right, you are still co-signing them by participating in them, right? So it's like, yeah, we might not agree with the idea of capitalism, but we all participate within a capitalist framework and within capitalist institutions, whether we like it or not. And our very participation in it is a form of agreement that then co-signs its legitimacy and keeps it existing, right? It's like the classic chicken or egg scenario, and it's really hard to navigate, right? But stay with me. So, right, when I think about ICE today, I think about the slave patrols of the antebellum South, and I see very clearly a through line. I see the connections. I see how both of these institutions, though they were operating at different times and different contexts, they serve the same idea, which is that some people belong, and the people who are designated to belong by this system, have the right to enact violence on the other people who are not designated to belong. So, as a person who has studied history very intentionally, it is not a stretch of my imagination to imagine ICE agents going door to door. It's not a stretch of my imagination to know that ICE agents have the ability to kill U.S. citizens who are attempting to protect other people, right? Because all of that shit happened in the antebellum South. Those slave patrols were going door to door. And if you were a person who may have been part of the belonging group, like if you were a white person who was protecting, right, Black people during that time, they would kill you, right? So all of these things are not new. It seems new, but they are all ideas that have been socially constructed that over time, specifically within like the framework of these Western societies, have been agreed to with that collective co-signing, right? So, we take the AI example of the technocracy, the tech billionaires presenting this idea and putting it out there to be agreed upon, right? People were not given the option to opt out of AI. It was just like, AI is not here yet, but it's coming. And now it's like, AI is it's here, right? There's no, it's not presented as a choice. It's like a parent presenting like a meal for a child, right? Like, it's like, some parents are like, oh, do you want this or this, right? And some parents are like, this is the meal and this is what you get. So that is an example of how these systems pull on that collective energy that's always around us and present their ideas, and then turn those ideas into reality by getting people to co-sign them in whatever way. And on the flip side, right, when I'm thinking about the question of, okay, if we are living in a context where, once again, it is very blatant and apparent that agents of state violence and repression are able to come into the public space and also private space and enact violence, right? Where, we have neighbors, we have community members who we might want to protect. But at the same time, just the very idea of protecting them also places our bodies and our safeties on the line, right? That's always been a part of the system. So we are at this time where all of these things are unveiling themselves. Now, I've written about this before in my newsletter, but right, the idea of the apocalypse, and apocalypse coming from, the Greek and Latin root, which means to unveil, right? So the apocalypse is just a series of unveiling the truth that has always existed beyond the surface, right? We've been in this moment for a long time. It didn't just start, in 2024 with the current presidential administration, or even in that last term, all the way back in like 2016. It didn't start in 2020, right? These things have been unveiling themselves for decades now, right? So how do we come together and keep one another safe? How do we think outside of the boxes that are given to us and presented as the only option, right? We live in a world where we've been very conditioned to okay, we live in a democracy. We live in a free democracy, right? That's what we're told. And so what do you do in a free democracy? If you don't like something, well, you have your First Amendment right, and you go and you have the right to protest, right? But we know what that means, right? The right to protest with the presence of police officers. You have the right to protest, but when you are protesting, whether it be peaceful or not, those agents of state violence, police officers, and other agents of state violence can abuse you physically. They can arrest you without cause. They can tear gas you. They can perpetuate all these forms of violence against you within that right. So yeah, you got the right to show up in the streets, but you got to get a permit. You got to have the police there. Oh, and by the way, the police can and will probably arrest you, spray you with chemical agents, tackle you, pin you to the ground, right? So yes, we have this agreed upon, right to protest, but within it, we have also agreed upon, the state repressing that right. So those are the boxes, right? We've been given these boxes. You come into this box and you can protest, but these are all the ways that the state will repress that protest. But you can keep doing it, right? And we've seen that time and time again. You see it. We've seen it in 2020. We saw it before in the civil rights movement, where people would come together and protest, and they would get hosed down and chased by dogs and stuff like this. Again, these are not new things, right? They've just been made over to seem like they're new ideas, to seem like, oh my God, society is disintegrating in this way. But all of this violence has been inscripted into the very framework of the societies that we have existed within for the past several centuries, right? So this is not new. It is not new that protesting individuals are met with state violence and repression. That has been happening, right? Because no state, no government, no nation is going to actually give anyone the right to dismantle it, right? Okay. So how do we keep each other safe? How do we think outside of those boxes? Because for a long time, when I was coming of age, I was during the height of Black Lives Matter movement and all of this stuff. And we were given this box. You protest. And then if you protest, well, what do? You write down the number for the lawyer, and because you know that you might get arrested and you might get brutalized, but that's just part of it, right? And part of keeping each other safe meant showing up to these protests, meant putting our bodies on the line, right? But now we are dealing with even greater weapons of violence. So how do we keep each other safe? what do we do when it's not, when putting our bodies on the line no longer works, right? Because like to a system that renders everyone expendable, it does not matter. And I think the thing that was so startling about, the murder of Renee Good, right, is that a lot of people, particularly people who have privileged identities, particularly white people, had not recognized that this system also renders them expendable, right? Within these political and economic systems, every life is expendable. It does not matter the identities that you hold. It does not matter how much you do for the system. It does not matter how much the system can exploit you, right? It does not matter how much you believe in the system. We're all expendable. So it doesn't matter if a bunch of white people are showing up and trying to protect or keep eye or, watch out for their neighbors, because they are also expendable. It does not matter if a bunch of U.S. citizens are putting their bodies on the line and trying to protect people who don't have the protections of citizenship, because the protections of citizenship do not mean that you are not expendable to this system, right? So how do we protect each other? And at the very beginning of this video, I talked about being a spiritual person. I talked about that groundswell of energy that's always available to us. And in times like this, when the boxes that we have been given within the system that haven't been working are working at even less than they have been, I return to that groundswell of energy that we have to pull on. And I'm going to give y'all just a real quick, I'm going to give you an anecdote from my personal life. And I'm going to give you some further readings, right? On my website, you can find, ChariceMorris.com, you can find a link to an essay I wrote years ago, back in 2018. It's called The Cosmic Matter of Black Lives, and I get more into some of these ideas in that essay. So if this piques your interest, I would recommend that you go to my website and look on my works page, and you should be able to find it linked there. But I'll give two stories. So I'll start with the story from my life. Years ago, I had two family members who were hit by a car in a very high-profile act of violence towards protesters. And after that moment, and this was at a moment when I was beginning to learn all of my, think about spiritual knowledge and spiritual wisdom in a different way. So at that moment, I decided that something I would do regularly would be to just find dedicated time to do protection workings, to pray protection over my immediate family. And I would do this, on a regular schedule. And so since that time, I've been doing this. And, on the one hand, right, it comforts me, because I feel like even if I can't control all of the variables in the world at large, right, I can do something, and that makes me feel just on a mental, energetic level, it makes me feel powerful and capable and comforted in that sense. But so I do these regularly. And a couple weeks ago, I had realized that I had been busy at the top of the year, and I had forgot to do my protection working. And so I was like, oh my God, girl, let me do this protection working. Let me let me pray my protection over my family. And so I did it that day. As soon as I thought about it, a week later, I get a call from my partner, and a car was merging onto the highway and hit him, and he got into a car accident. And the car that was merging over and hit him actually flipped over over itself and landed upside down and pinned the guy who was in the car down, and he couldn't get out, and he had these injuries. His car was totaled, and I'm freaking out, because that is literally one of my biggest nightmares. And then there's also all of the other things, oh my God, then are we down a vehicle, all of this stuff. And I was like, well, what's happening? Are you going to the hospital? And he's like, no, I'm totally fine. And I'm like, okay, he's fine, but I'm sure the car is totaled, and now we're gonna have to figure out how to get a new vehicle. And I rush home to meet him, and he drove his car home, And it was totally fine. And just like one of his headlights, you know, had gotten like, you know, knocked out, and like a part of the side of his bumper was like kind of like, you know, crushed down. But otherwise, the vehicle was fine. He was fine, right? And so in that moment, I was like, oh my God, thankfully, I did my protection working, because what I can't do, right? I can't control the variables of the world. I can't control when other people are driving and not paying attention and, you know, like on their phones, driving recklessly, whatever. I can't control any of that. And when we might encounter any of those people. But what I can do is pull into that groundswell of energy that is always creating the reality of the day. And I can ask that my people are protected, right? And so at the end of the day, right, he was protected. And in my eyes, of course, that was me like, okay, like, I just did, thankfully, right? Thank God I just did the protection working. I prayed this protection a week ago, because if I had not, who knows what could have happened, right? Who knows how different that situation could have been. Another example, and I'm gonna take it back to like some historical examples too. But like another example, I was like drifting. It was a snowstorm. I'm going to pick up my kids, and like it's kind of like that snow that came out of nowhere. So there's no salt down. The roads are like super slippery, and I am literally just like leaving my home, make a turn, and I start drifting. My tires are worn, they're old, and I'm like, oh my God, there are 6 lanes of traffic oncoming. I drift, my car drifts all the way across the street, and ends up like drifting and turning around backwards on the wrong side of the road. And basically, to make a long story short, within those 6 lanes of oncoming traffic, at rush hour, I was totally fine. My car was fine. I just turned it around and drove away, right? And like, you know, again, you can't control the variables like running into bad road conditions, but maybe, just maybe, right? Some of this energy, you know, these protection workings are actually in some way covering me and covering my family, right? Now I'll take it back to some historical examples. I read a book years ago. It's called Black Conjure. There's like another part of the title, or Black Magic, Conjure in the Southern tradition. It's by Yvonne Sherrill. If you look up Yvonne Sherrill, I'm sure it will come up. But in that book, they detail all of these instances taken from like, you know, oral histories or from biographies of enslaved people, some very famous like Harriet Jacobs, Frederick Douglass, talking about how, you know, people very often used spiritual work to sort of protect themselves within that incredibly violent environment. So there is, she writes about these accounts from the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, where he literally writes about, you know, visiting, I think like the conjure man, right, on the plantation, who had knowledge of, you know, spiritual traditions and wisdoms, right, from Africa. And he visited that man, and because Frederick Douglass was perceived as being kind of like a know-it-all, right? He was perceived as being an enslaved person who was not quite in his place. He learned to read. He carried himself, right, in a manner that like wasn't as downtrodden, I guess, as he was expected to. And the overseer of the plantation was very hard on him. Would pick him out to very specifically like make an example of him. And he writes in his autobiography about going to, you know, the conjure man on the plantation, and having, you know, these protective workings, prayers done over him, and how it became like impossible for the overseer to discipline him in the way that he had been. So he would like raise his hand, or he would go to raise his whip, and like he would just keel over in pain, right? And there are other accounts in this book of similar things happening on different plantations with different people, right? There are accounts in this book of, you know, white people who participated in the slave trade, white people who, you know, owned other human beings, of them writing about how, so-and-so went to the conjure person and had, got these prayers, and all of a sudden they are protected in these ways, right? About how the most dangerous person on the plantation, right, was the conjure people, because, they couldn't get to them. They could not violate them in the same ways, right? And so when I read that years ago, immediately my mind clicked on. And I was like, okay, we're getting into good things. And then, I had learned about the Haitian Revolution in college. I read all these books, I read about like the political strategy and all of this stuff and this and that. And years later, I learned, not in college, outside of college, I learned that the very first event of the Haitian Revolution was a spiritual event. And so I'm like, oh, because the question had always been, how did these enslaved people who, are working with much less, how did they come together to defeat one of the most powerful armies in the world? How did they defeat Napoleon's forces, right? But then I heard, oh, there was a spiritual component to this work. And again, being myself, being that spiritual person that I am, I was like, that makes sense, right? So much of what we do is energetic. And I say spiritual because I want to divorce this from the context of any particular belief. And I'm sure as I make more videos, I'll talk more about this, right? My understanding, again, is that there's a groundswell of energy that is accessible to all living beings to pull on, right? And that energy creates the all of life, right? And it is mysterious and it is infinite. But as a living being, we are connected to it because we are just a manifestation of part of that infinite, mysterious energy that creates and destroys and recreates everything, right? And throughout human time, different groups of people have come to know that energy in different ways, by different names, by different stories, right? But at the end of the day, it all represents the same energy, right? So I think about it in that context, and I am divorced from the boundaries of one specific belief system. I also know that I come from a constellation of ancestors who have believed in so many different things across so many different spaces, like geographically. And I have access to all of the different things that all these ancestors have believed in. So I don't want to limit myself, to just picking one when I see all of them as valid and true in their own way to whatever group of people they're valid and true to, right? So in this groundswell of energy, I'm thinking about examples from my personal life, right? What do I do for my family that keeps us wrapped in a blanket of safety and protection, right? And it doesn't prevent us from interacting with the variables and the chaotic variables of the world around us and other people. I'm not saying it, that it just poof makes all of that go away, but I am saying that it provides something that cushions us in a way. And I am saying that, again, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacob, all of these people from these narratives that found their way into Yvonne Chouinard's book, they were not protected from the violences of enslavement, of the system of chattel slavery, right? The poof, racism just didn't go away for them, right? But they were cushioned in a way that kept them safer, even though they were engaging with these violent forces around them. And I'm not saying, again, in the context of the Haitian Revolution, poof, the oppressors didn't just go away. It wasn't just like, well, we're free, It was a long road. It was a 10-year war. And even the ramifications of that, right? And the ways that, Haiti, being the first Black republic, was very specifically targeted by the rest of the Western world. And that country is still dealing with the fallout of that. But pulling on that groundswell of spiritual, infinite, mysterious energy, right? And bending it towards their will in that way did provide them with some sort of cushion that made what seemed impossible not only possible, but actually happen, right? So in times like this, I'm thinking about how we protect each other. We know that putting our bodies on the line just means that, like, they will kill, like, indiscriminately, right? With impunity, right? Because that's how it has been. But how do we come together and do this protective working, not just for our individual families, not just on a one-on-one basis, but how do we come together in community and do this protective working for our community, right? How do we replicate this on a larger scale? Now, I've been talking long enough, and this is a long enough video. If you've made it to the end, bless you, and thank you. I'm gonna do another video. I'll talk some more. I'll get more into these ideas, but I just wanted to put that out there. Again, if you are interested, I would highly recommend that you look back to the Cosmic Matter of Black Lives, that essay I mentioned before. You could find Yvonne Sherrow's book. You can look back just through like earlier newsletters, right? This is not new. I've been talking about this sort of stuff for a while, but I feel it's very important for me to present alternatives to people at this time, because like we are in a time, like, again, like I said, none of this violence is new, but it is ramping up, and all of the illusions and the veils that have been put over it to masquerade it are pulling away, right? And we're seeing that, and people are seeing that, and they are uncertain, and they don't know what to do, and they don't know what's coming next, right? And part of the system, it operates on keeping us in that fight or flight, that fear mode, that uncertainty, because we can't make cohesive decisions. We can't, you know, like, if people love to talk about co-creating a future, but people can't co-create a future when they are constantly living in a cycle of fight or flight fear, right? Like, when our nervous systems are deliberately being picked apart by the vultures of this system to keep us immobilized, to keep us from coming together, from rising up, from creating the changes that we want to see, right? So what's the first step? Is to cover ourselves in some way. And maybe everything I'm saying is not substantiated, right? But it's something. It's something. And I think it's important that we have something, you know? And again, it doesn't matter what you believe in. It doesn't matter what your experience level is, right? It's about getting us together to connect. When I think about that groundswell of spiritual, infinite, mysterious, creative, destructive, beautiful, ugly energy that is the all of everything that is present in creating life in this universe, right? We are all connected to it. And if we are all connected to it, then that means that we are all connected to one another, right? And so part of overcoming this moment is recognizing the points of connection that we have, not just to one another, not just to people in our immediate community, but to all, and also to that groundswell of energy, right? Life is a manifestation of that energy. And again, we can't control all the variables, the bad things, the scary things, the violent things. They don't just go poof, right? But we can have agency, and we can have power, and we can we can pull on that natural connection that exists within that energy, and we can direct it towards what we want, right? So that's all I'm going to say for now. It's been a long video. Again, if you made it this far, I thank you. Please drop comments, questions, anything below. I don't know the deal. I know people say like, subscribe, whatever. So like, subscribe, and share if you feel called to. And I will be back next time, eventually, whenever that is, with more thoughts on all this stuff. But until then, be blessed.